is Harold Scott Roth, and I'd like to welcome you to this session of the Center for the Economics of the Internet here at the Hudson Institute. We're extremely honored today to have with us Commissioner Michael O'Rielly of the Federal Communications Commission. Before we start with Commissioner O'Rielly, just a couple of housekeeping matters. First of all, at the end of February, Jeff Lee of the Hudson Institute and I will be presenting a session on our preliminary research findings on measuring the contribution of the internet to various economic contribution to various industries using some new techniques that we have. So we'll be announcing the date of that soon. Second, for our online audience from C-SPAN, welcome to the Hudson Institute. If you have questions for our speaker today, please send them via Twitter to @Hudson Institute, and we will be incorporating those questions with other questions from our audience. It's my great pleasure and honor to introduce Commissioner Michael O'Rielly today. You can find his formal biography at the Federal Communications Commission website. I will give you the informal biography, which is that Commissioner O'Rielly and I were staff members together at the House Commerce Committee nearly 20 years ago, longer than either of us probably cares to remember. And we both had the great privilege of working on the Telecommunications Act of 1996 for Chairman Tom Bliley. I've known Commissioner O'Rielly for many years, and there are two salient characteristics about Commissioner O'Rielly. One is integrity. He is an extremely honest fellow and is known for that. And the other is extremely good judgment and discretion. And those characteristics have served him well over the past 18 years as a staff member on Capitol Hill, which on Capitol Hill is an extraordinarily long career. And his bosses in the House and in the Senate have valued both his integrity and his judgment over the years, and I think those are extraordinarily good characteristics to have as a new commissioner of the Federal Communications Commission. I also want to congratulate Commissioner O'Rielly on his recently announced engagement, and with that, let me turn the floor over to Commissioner O'Rielly. Please welcome Commissioner O'Rielly.
Let me begin by thanking my good friend and former colleague Harold Scott Roth for arranging this event. As Harold mentioned many years ago, and as what is now called the House Energy and Commerce Committee, Harold and I worked together helping to craft the bipartisan Telecommunications Act of 1996. He went on to serve with distinction as a commissioner of the Federal Communications Commission, and over the years he's been a thoughtful advisor to me on many issues. I also want to thank the Hudson Institute and its exceptional scholars and work, including my friend and predecessor, former FCC Commissioner Rob McDowell. As has been previously mentioned, I am the newest FCC Commissioner. I was fortunate enough to be confirmed as alongside our new chairman, Tom Wheeler. In our short tenures, we both have come to be known for certain taglines that have prompted further questioning. His has been competition. Mine has been freedom. The chairman has, on a number of occasions, articulated what he means by his term. Today, I would like to explain more about what I mean by mine. I bring to this position a core belief that the most enduring value of America is freedom. Our nation began with the desire to be free from the paternalistic monarchy in Britain. To preserve these freedoms, our forefathers embedded into the Constitution certain protections to ensure that the government does not abuse its power or harmfully restrict individual liberty. These principles of a free society, such as freedom of speech, religion, and assembly, and so forth, are also inherent in the concepts of free markets. From which we form the basis of our economy. In our system of free enterprise, we hold the belief that consumers and businesses should be able to freely buy and sell without needing the permission of the government and with minimal restrictions placed on business activity or asset ownership. To illustrate why this economic freedom is so important, let me relate a story from my youth. One hot summer day near Buffalo, New York, it actually does happen, my younger brother, a good friend, and I decided to start selling delicious lemonade to thirsty consumers. To be clear, this wasn't your cute, adorable kid sitting on the front lawn selling juice. Instead, it was a brash effort to make real money. The three of us did what every good business does. We obtained necessary beverage supplies, designed and built a mobile stand, and did market research. We even reimbursed our capital provider, my dad. At our major rollout, we hit the town's annual tennis tournament, because who doesn't like a cold drink while watching a match or after completing a tough three-setter? Initial success prompted us to dream of expansion possibilities and what to do with our many millions. But with all sweet stories comes a point. It just so happens that the vast number of tennis courts were in parks owned by the city. Our prime location was the local high school, also owned by the city. It wasn't long before we hit a nerve. By the second weekend of the tournament, our business was effectively snuffed out when a local official informed us that we couldn't occupy the location right next to the tennis courts and the planetarium. The world was deprived of our refreshing product. Admittedly, we were kids, and I was able to focus on a paper route instead. But this provides a good example of the lost opportunity that occurs when the government restricts entrepreneurs. There is a loss to the would-be seller, the would-be buyer, and society as a whole. As a staffer on Capitol Hill, I saw the same theme play out time and time again in a setting with far more serious consequences. The most absurd example that comes to mind was back in 1996, when the FDA tried to tell Sunny Cloud, a single mother in Atlanta, Georgia, that she couldn't market at-home drug testing kits. These were the exact same kits that were available to employers. The FDA's rationale for such a prohibition? The belief that parents may not react appropriately if their children tested positive for drugs. Until public and congressional outrage ended this rule, the federal agency was allowed to target a small business that was trying to empower parents. Who knows how many young people have been saved from a life of drug addiction due to the early detection through the use of these home tests, which are still available. More often, however, such constraints are more subtle and difficult to spot. Take, for instance, the failed merger of the top two video rental giants, Blockbuster and Hollywood Video, back in 2005. After the Federal Trade Commission signaled a likely rejection, the companies abandoned the deal. About that time, regulators were concerned about the anti-competitive effects of one company having a significant percentage of the home video market. But they failed to account for the rise of videos delivered through vending machines, mail, and internet streaming such as Netflix. Both Blockbuster and Hollywood Video declared bankruptcy in 2010. Who knows how much longer a combined entity could have lasted, or if their combined assets would allow it to innovate and be better adapt to the changing market. Policymakers in Washington, D.C. should be constantly on guard against unnecessary restrictions that interfere with the freedoms of any willing buyer or seller in our economy because, just like the examples I provided, we have no idea what type of products or services our regulations may discourage from coming to market. Championing economic freedom will be my guiding principle when it comes to overseeing the communications industry. To inform my decisions, I will consider the following. First, the Commission must consider whether it has the authority to regulate, as well as realizing the confines of that authority. There is no place in the rules for policies, even ones that are well-meaning, that have no basis in the statute. The Commission exists to implement the statute, no less and certainly no more. Second, the Commission must have verifiable and specific evidence that there is market failure before acting. In many cases, competition and industry self-regulation are sufficient to ensure that services are provided and consumers are protected. And it should only regulate when there's evidence, bona fide data, that an actual problem exists, resulting in real harm to consumers that the Commission can solve. Third, when the Commission does intervene, its solutions should be carefully tailored and apply only to the relevant set of providers or services. We must guard against over-regulating by analogy. Fourth, The benefit of regulation must outweigh the burdens. Even when rules are grounded in the statute, based on evidence, addressing a real harm, and targeted at a specific problem, there is still a cost to intervening, and we must consider those costs as part of our analysis. Let's accept the reality that costs are always passed on to consumers in one way or another. We often hear it said that the Commission's rules have not kept pace with changes in technology and the marketplace, and that is true. The communications sector is in the midst of a digital revolution. Companies are innovating and thriving. They are investing billions each year in new networks and technologies. And consumers are benefiting from a vast array of services and products not imagined years ago. But while some advocate for automatically applying antiquated rules to new cutting-edge technologies, I do not believe that legacy rules or constructs are entitled to live on after their usefulness. When it comes to encouraging competition and consumer choice, I start from the premise that removing regulation where it is not needed will better serve these goals. To ensure that participants in the communication marketplace are as free as possible to meet consumer demand, I believe the Commission must periodically re-examine its rules and the justifications that underlie those rules. Over time, those justifications may have eroded or changed. That is why I will consistently advocate for sunset provisions to force the Commission to make sure our rules are still relevant. Now you may be wondering, how does this thinking apply to specific communications issues? Let me share my thoughts about a few matters currently before the Commission. I'll begin with a topic that is not only of immediate importance, but also longstanding interest of mine, IP transitions. Our nation is quickly moving from analog POTS, plain old telephone service, to voice over internet protocol. We're also relying more and more on wireless voice, texting, and broadband. As we leave the traditional telephone network behind, there are some unanswered questions about the potential implications of an all-IP world. The Commission is poised to embark on IP trials to help answer some of these questions. When it comes to IP transitions, I believe the Commission must ensure that its policies and regulations do not impede this innovation so that providers are free to implement the latest technologies and services. When it comes to governing the forthcoming IP trial specifically, I suggest the following criteria. First, any trial should not interfere with the choices that consumers are already making every day to go with IP services. Let me give you an idea of the magnitude of these choices. By the end of 2008, when the Commission began certain tracking of residential VoIP connections, subscribers had already topped 19 million, or 20% of the residential wireline market. Just 4 years later, that figure grew to over 34 million, representing over 43%. VoIP growth is even more notable when you consider that total wireline connections went down by over 24 million during that same period. In other words, the IP transitions are well underway, and the Commission should not allow these trials to obstruct industry innovation or consumer adoption. Second, trials should not delay the Commission's work. The trials won't resolve many important legal and policy issues. Therefore, they should not serve as an excuse for delaying appropriate decisions. Separate from the trials, I doubt that many of the old rules will be necessary going forward. We should take this opportunity to see how many regulations we can live without, such as arcane regulatory accounting and jurisdictional separations. Finally, it should be made clear that the Commission that any rules the Commission establishes in the trials will be non-binding on what is happening outside the trials or for future decisions. These trials should be exactly that, trials, not stalking horses for new regulations. Next, the Commission must continue updating its universal service programs. Universal service is a fundamental and long-standing principle of communication policy. It should be approached in a thoughtful manner and with recognition of the differences in our vast nation. Some regions already have access to modern communication services, somewhat as a result of universal service funding. Others remain unserved. The challenge we face is taking finite ratepayer funding and targeting it effectively to preserve and advance universal service. I'm encouraged by some of the reforms already adopted. Subsidizing multiple competitors, especially in areas that have already received significant funding, is declining. High-cost support that was not well targeted or serving the intended purposes is being phased out. And the link-up program has been eliminated in most areas. I also support the chairman's commitment to revisit the quantile regression analysis, the QRA benchmarks. When rules like the QRA benchmarks are not operating as intended, then those rules should be replaced. As we move forward, we should consider a variety of approaches to complete universal service reform, consistent with our 2011 order. For example, I am interested in deploying the Remote Areas Fund, which was intended to bring basic voice and broadband service to extremely high-cost areas through a variety of technology platforms, including satellite and fixed wireless. We must fully explore, again, consistent with our 2011 order, all ideas to ensure that consumers in hard-to-serve parts of the country do not get left behind. We must also remain mindful of the size of the fund, because the burden of paying for these programs ultimately falls on ratepayers. While the size of the fund may be down from last year, there is no overall cap. As we continue to reform the various programs, we should look for ways to offset the cost of modernization within existing budgets. Budgets make for hard choices, but those hard choices force efficiency, encourage innovation, and benefit ratepayers. To put this in perspective, the contribution factor this quarter is already an incredible 16.4% and is likely to increase further in the coming years. Therefore, contribution reform is long overdue. However, it must be addressed in a manner that is fair for everyone, providers, recipients, and American consumers. And it should not be reformed in a way that dampens internet usage or increases overall consumer costs. Finally, we need to take a close look at program management. Projected requirements, which drive contributions, are consistently much higher than actual disbursements. While it makes some sense to plan for specific future expenses, the reserve should not be more than absolutely necessary at any given time. We also should review administration expenses, which have been trending upward. One of the last pieces of legislation I worked on as a congressional staffer that was enacted into law was the Middle Class Tax Relief and Job Creation Act of 2012. It directed the Commission to hold a broadcast spectrum incentive auction. Providing this platform to transfer spectrum from willing broadcasters to wireless service providers is a great example of further injecting market forces into spectrum policy. As Congress directed, the resulting revenue will pay for First Responder Network Authority, the Next Generation 911 programs, and deficit reduction, among others. This will be the most complicated spectrum auction in our history. Technically, we need to be able to simultaneously integrate the reverse auction to obtain spectrum with the forward auction to allocate the spectrum for wireless use while repacking remaining broadcasters. In order to be successful, we need many things to fall into place correctly, including broadcaster participation, because without them, the auction simply fails. Educating broadcasters about their options, whether it be selling spectrum, channel sharing, or moving from UHF to VHF, will be an enormous challenge. It will be an even greater uphill climb if the auction rules and processes are complex or confusing. Similarly, we must remain attentive to the concerns of those broadcasters interested in being repacked. Simplicity and transparency are paramount to providing broadcasters the certainty needed to decide whether to participate in the auctions or continue to serve their communities. Failure to do so may deter broadcaster participation or lead to legal challenges that could significantly delay the auction. I also feel strongly the Commission must not implement rules designed to preordain auction results or place undue restrictions on licenses. Such efforts have failed in the past, and now more than ever, we cannot afford to diminish participation or revenues. Instead, the Commission must allow licenses to go to their highest valued use and ensure spectrum flexibility. If, as I hope, the auctions are successful, consumers will benefit enormously as wireless providers use the new spectrum to build the next generation of networks and provide faster and better service throughout our nation. Last but not least, media ownership is also an area where the Commission needs to take action. Section 202H of the Telecommunications Act of 1996 mandates that the Commission review its media ownership rules every 4 years or quadrennially to determine whether they are still necessary due to competition. If they are not, we must modify or eliminate rules that are no longer in the public interest. We have failed to comply with this congressional directive. Specifically, the Commission hasn't released its 2010 order and is arguably behind on its 2014 review. When Congress extended the media ownership review from a 2-year to a 4-year requirement, the intention was to ensure a thoughtful, competitive analysis of the space. Instead, what has resulted is regulatory paralysis. I'm aware of the difficulties in completing this task and the corresponding legal challenges, including the Third Circuit's ruling. Nonetheless, we are required to comply with the statute. Let's face it, the media landscape has changed dramatically. We no longer live in a world where Americans obtain information solely from local broadcasters and newspapers. We have satellite providers, cable networks, the internet, and mobile platforms. I'm open to thoughtfully updating the Commission's rules to reflect the realities of today's marketplace. Today I've shared with you some of my thoughts about what freedom is and how it applies to the work of the Commission. In closing, I would like to acknowledge the simple fact that there will be differences of opinion over how this principle will be applied. When I use the word freedom, I do not mean to imply that I hold a monopoly or trademark on this value. I have seen throughout my professional career that the robust exchange of ideas and bipartisan compromises can produce the best policy result. Already, I have found my colleagues to be incredibly thoughtful and dedicated public servants. Everyone has a different background and perspective that can help balance decision-making. The same goes for the career staff. I've been most impressed by the depth of knowledge, expertise, and work ethic that they demonstrate on a daily basis. Finally, I also believe that input from thinkers inside and outside the communications industry is essential. So I want to hear from everyone on the issues currently facing the Commission and those issues that will confront us in the future. Please know my door is always open. My contact information, as well as the contact information of my staff, is publicly available on the FCC's website. My Twitter handle is MikeOFCC, and I stand ready and willing, as time permits, to participate in public forums and policy discussions such as this. Thank you so very much for your time. It has been such an honor to speak before you today, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you for those very thoughtful comments, Commissioner. Very powerful ideas about freedom, four principles for regulation that I just want to review with you. Authority to regulate, verifiable evidence of market failure, carefully tailored rules, benefits outweigh costs. I'd like to ask you just a few questions along those lines. One, a little over a week ago, the D.C. Circuit issued its opinion on the network neutrality order. What do you think of the D.C. Circuit's opinion, and how do you think the rules that were tossed out by the D.C. Circuit kind of lined up with your four concepts of regulation?
So as Harold mentioned, he and I had a chance to work together on the Telecommunications Act of 1996. And we had an opportunity to work specifically on Section 706. So we're quite familiar with the provision, how it was drafted, how it was crafted, what it was meant to do, what it was not meant to do. I've articulated a couple times in the last couple weeks on what I think should have happened in the court case, and obviously I have deep reservations. I actually disagree with the court's decision in this space because I believe the Commission did not have authority to issue the rules. I think that 706 has been abused, and it should be returned to its original intent that we helped frame years ago. So I have difficulty with that part of the equation. It makes it harder to get to the second part of the equation, which is that the FCC rules were thrown out, and what to do going forward is a question that we've been posed many times, and I think we're still, I think the Commission as a whole is trying to digest what to go forward with.
What do you think Chairman Wheeler will do about the network neutrality rules?
You know, I've learned long ago not to try and guess what other people do in D.C. In this environment that we live in. I do not have an insight on what the chairman may or may not do in this space. He has articulated a couple times in the last couple weeks what the authority that he believes he has, the Commission has, and what they would like to do. So I have to take him at his word, and we'll have to see what comes from that. But I'd hate to guess more than that.
The House Energy and Commerce Committee is beginning to hold hearings about a possible rewrite of the Communications Act. I'm sure you've been following this closely. If, what advice would you give to the House Energy and Commerce Committee as they look at rewriting the Communications Act?
Well, I would say first and foremost that I defer to my friends and former colleagues on the House and the Senate on the timing and the structure and the format of any type of consideration of a rewrite of the Communications Act. But I'm also made myself available in any way I can to help them as they proceed on the process going forward. So in terms of advice, I think it'd be unfortunate for me to give them advice. The advice should come from Congress to me. So I look forward to working with them in any way I can. But I hope that they take a very thoughtful approach to this. It looks like it may take a little bit of time, and that's probably a good thing.
Well, I have to say it's very refreshing to hear an FCC commissioner say they want to get advice from Congress rather than the other way around. Speaking of which, Senator Rockefeller has proposal to substantially expand the schools and libraries program, and there's been some discussion, I understand, at the FCC about that. Is this an area where the FCC is actively working, and how do you see a possible expansion of schools and libraries program fitting within the overall universal service framework of 254?
So, as I've previously articulated, I'm supportive of Chairman Rockefeller's effort to modernize universal service program, specifically the E-rate part of it. I am open to figuring out how best to do that. The Commission has an NPRM in this space and is examining how best to do that. I favor moving to a less complicated system. I'd like for one that also addresses the total costs going forward. So if we're going to increase speeds, how can we function within budgets that I previously talked about? So there is common ground in terms of modernizing the program. It will come down to specifics going forward. In terms of how it fits within all the different pieces, as you know very well, universal service for E-rate is capped. Unlike the one piece, there is one remaining piece that's not capped. And so that piece is something we're going to have to look at and how it relates to the other three pieces.
In your talk, Commissioner, you mentioned about the importance of periodic reviews of regulations to see whether they're working or not. The Commission has, in fact, Communications Act, Section 11 requires these periodic reviews, in addition to a series of other administrative laws that I think the Commission is bound by. Not entirely sure. Where do you see, for example, the Schools and Libraries program or other programs such as network neutrality fitting into periodic reviews of Commission rules?
So I would take my principle and apply it across the board. So I don't think there's anything that should be excluded from that universe. We should look at every rule and make sure that it consistently goes forward and is still relevant in the modern communications marketplace. So I think every aspect, and I think that's what we're talking about when we consider modernization of the E-rate program. What should it look for? How should it look going forward, and how does it fit into the other universal service programs? I think that every program should be looked at periodically.
There are government programs that have caught both the attention and imagination and perhaps even some of the fears of American consumers in recent weeks. And that has to do with NSA collection of information and new proposed rules from the administration requiring telecommunications and other companies to maintain information about customers for many years. Is this an issue in which the FCC is actively engaged, and what role, if any, do you see the FCC playing with collection of information and requirements on telecommunications carriers?
Well, I should start by saying at this point, I do not have security clearance in any fashion, so I don't know anything of anyone's information. Is this something I think that the Commission will weigh in. I think that we stand ready to provide advice to other agencies and other government departments that may be involved in this space, but I'm not sure that this is something the commission should spend considerable amount of time going forward.
I was amused by your description of the Blockbuster Hollywood merger that was turned down. There have been others over the years. WorldCom Sprint in 2000 got blocked because of monopolization of something called the long-distance telecommunications market. What do you see as the role of the FCC in merger reviews, and how do you see that playing out and coordinating with the antitrust agencies?
So first I would suggest that, and this is something that we spent a considerable amount of time when I was as a congressional staffer, we tried to figure out how to simplify the process to make sure it's completely thorough, but it is simplified in the sense that you don't have duplicative agencies reviewing the same information. While they do have different statutes depending on the agency, there isn't over-aggressive attempt to gather information that can be duplicative to work that's done at another agency. So there's a way to probably simplify the review process. But beyond that, I think the Commission has an obligation under the statute, under the public interest, to ensure that mergers are in the best interest of consumers. But there is a level of review that sometimes gets exceeded here, and I would like to see our process be simplified while still providing thorough review.
You were a staffer at the very highest levels of Congress for many years. What sorts of issues do you think capture the imagination of members of Congress and the Senate the most when someone tells a senator something's going on at the FCC? What are the issues that immediately jump to mind for senators and congressmen?
Well, in complete fairness to my former employers, they do have a lot of issues going on and a lot of committees they spend their time on and a lot of things that are happening on the floor. So they have a lot of responsibilities. Specifically, and in my last closing days of my time on Capitol Hill, I was working on the most pressing matters before the Congress. So communications issues are extremely important, and I acknowledge that, and I'm happy and pleased to be in the position that I'm at. But I would suggest the members have to balance this with all the other items that they have to consider and they have to work on, and some of those can be a little bit more timely depending on the subject matter. So it is tough to balance all of those requirements for a member of Congress, and so working through those type of things, I think when people approach members of Congress about the FCC, they certainly take interest in the matter because they know how significant it is to the economic growth of the United States, and they certainly do, and have been tasked with this many a day, to further inquire about the issue that was raised by whomever may have spoke to a member. So I've done a ton of legwork after the fact of whatever question was posed to a member of Congress, because there is interest. It just may not be immediate, timely to their schedule.
I was both pleased and amused to hear your list of the pressing issues that you analyzed. There were 4 issues, one of which, if I'd been giving this speech as a new commissioner 16 years ago, would have been on my list as well, which was media ownership. And if someone had asked me 16 years ago, would the media ownership rules be around 2 years later, I would have said, no, there's no chance, they're going to be gone. And yet they seem more entrenched than ever. Tell us where you see media ownership headed at the FCC. I sensed a little bit of frustration in your comments about where they are in court, but how do you see that playing out?
Well, in fairness, it is frustration on my part because I believe the Commission has an obligation under the statute that I helped work on behalf of a member of Congress. So I worked on extending the time frame from 2 years to 4 years. So I'm very familiar with what we expected out of the Commission. The fact that we haven't seen a number of activities recently is extremely disturbing. We're obligated, my new employer is obligated to comply with the statute. So I'm disappointed that we haven't so far. In terms of what may happen in the future, I'm hopeful the new chairman and my fellow colleagues will tackle this issue in short order. In terms of what may happen, I'm open to listening to all of the dialogue and all of and reading all of the record and having as much information as possible in deciding going forward.
Section 11 requires the commission to review its rules initially every 2 years, and it's been revised every 4 years. You mentioned the media ownership provision, again, revised every 4 years. There are other administrative law requirements, and yet it seems like rules never really are repealed. In fact, it really doesn't even seem like there's an awful lot of serious review of existing rules. What can be done to change that?
Well, in fairness to the commission, I think they have reviewed some rules recently in the last chairman's tenure and repealed a number of rules. The question is, are they the significant rules that probably have outlived their usefulness? And that's where we probably have probably not spent enough time or enough work on to deal with those situations. I mentioned too that going forward, depending on how these IP trials go forward, I'm interested in looking at accounting and jurisdictional separations, two universes that were designed long ago and probably in due of a great inspection going forward. And so hopefully the commission will do that. But you're right that the big issues have not been reviewed significantly by the commission, and we should spend some time doing that. That's part of our obligation under the Act and also our obligation as good stewards of the American taxpayers.
Well, I have probably overextended the prerogative of the moderator here. I should open it up to the floor for questions. And to our viewing audience, again, we're at Hudson Institute on Twitter. Please send your questions in on C-SPAN and on our direct video feed. Question up here in the front, and please identify yourself in the microphone so that our viewing audience can know who the question is coming from. And wait for the microphone.
Good afternoon, Commissioner. My name's Deanne Divis. I'm with Inside GNSS. Could you please give us your perspective on receiver standards and how legacy receivers would play into your perspective?
Okay, I'm happy to do so. I am open to hearing from all parts of the industry and users in this space, but I'll suggest in the many days of the closing days of my time in Capitol Hill, receiver standards actually did come up. It was something we talked about at length, and there is probably an opportunity to improve receiver standards. But I want to have more information from the record to exactly determine what that should mean. But there is some room to move forward on this item.
And please, clearly you've been talking about it. I understand that there are no receiver standards. Are you thinking of improving the rules, or what were you?
Well, the rules do govern receiver standards in some regards. So we do have, and we've had a number of fights recently over whether devices are meeting certain obligations and whether they should be improved to help prevent harmful interference from neighboring spectrum uses. So there have been conversations along those lines. Now, I'm open to reviewing the record and having a full dialogue on this conversation.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Question?
Commissioner Scott Cleland, precursor in net competition. You talked about the public interest test, and that is one where it's originally a concept that came from railroad regulation back in the 1880s that was put forward and appropriate in the 30s when it was a monopoly, and also the airways were viewed as government property. Since then, we're no longer have monopolies, and wireless can be and spectrum can be private property. What thoughts do you have on applying the public interest test now that the underlying facts of it's not a monopoly and it's a property? How should that now be applied? It doesn't seem appropriate that you'd apply it in an 1887 mindset.
Well, I would say that I spent a considerable amount of time reviewing the public interest over my time in Congress, working for a number of members. And we did go through a number of efforts on whether it should be continued, whether it should be modified, whether it should be eliminated. And the truth is, it isn't part of the statute, so I'm obligated to comply with the statute. In terms of how it applies going forward, we have to be careful on imposing abstract viewpoints on the public interest, trying to have, as I articulated, a number of things that I would like to see when we talk about my vision and what I'd like to see happen going forward. So we have to be careful on what we mean by public interest going forward. But it is part of the statute, so I'm required to comply with that obligation. But there have been a lot of conversations in my past life, and I'm sure there'll be ones going forward on whether to change or modify or eliminate, as people talk, as former Commissioner First Scott Roth talked about the rewrite of the Communications Act. So that would certainly be part of the dialogue, I imagine.
Next question. Well, let me see if I can follow up on Scott's question just briefly. The public interest is part of the Communications Act. At times, though, it seems like in some FCC orders it has become a substitute for other parts of the language. How do you see the public interest standard fitting in as sort of a final check on the other factors that the Commission must consider? Or do you think the public interest outweighs everything else?
Well, and I mean this in all due respect. I'm obligated to comply with the statute. I do not believe that the public interest should be a grab bag for any type of additional views that people would like to add to, whether it's a merger or whether it's additional obligations on any particular provider. I don't think it's something that should be just a grab bag. However, I think it's something that provides some maneuverability for the Commission in terms of depending on how it fits with the other conditions. I'm not sure that one outweighs the other, depending.
We have
from Lee, CD, and DC. And the question is Section 706 even still needed?
I have answered this recently, and I think consistent, my views haven't changed. I do not believe that those entities that were intended to be regulated by Section 706 in the Commission's Act, or the Commission's rules, are going to change their behavior going forward. And that's good for consumers. It's good for the companies. I think we're going to see a pretty fairly stable marketplace going forward. And so that's been my conversation with the providers, has been my conversation internally. So we're not expecting a dramatic shift in the paradigm given that the court struck down the FCC's rules in 706. So the second part is whether the authority of Section 706 and whether it exists for the Commission to do other things, and whether I believe it should still be in play. I have to defer to my former colleagues on the House and Senate. But if there was an avenue of area where, if someone was advocating that it be completely repealed, I don't think, in my view of how 706 is supposed to be operating, would cause that much heartburn.
a question in the back. Oh, hold on, if you could just wait for the microphone.
I'm Carrie Devra. I'm with the Center for Copyright Integrity. I have two questions.
Okay.
The first is something I've already addressed with Julie Brill. There's a plethora of sites that are popping up stealing people's identities, and you seem to be going on a whack-a-mole hunt trying to hit them down individually. Are you going to develop a set of rules that will stop this practice? Most of the sites that I've been tracking down, the 123 People, Spokio, Yatato, etc., are foreign countries, from foreign countries that are taking the identities of Americans and then bundling and tracking them. Second question addresses the effectiveness of the FCC in relationship to the YouTube and the online channels. I am reading more and more arguments and articles that you may not have an effectiveness in the online world.
So let me tackle your first question first. And I would need some more information on this, but I would suggest to you that we have a very active and aggressive Federal Trade Commission, and that may be who best focuses on this issue. But I am open to hearing more from you going forward. This has been something like I said, when I spent a lot of time on Capitol Hill, we tried to make sure that agencies didn't duplicate activity, and something that in terms of consumers' identity being stolen, something they spent more time on than the FCC. But I don't want to foreclose potential involvement. I just need more information. And on the second question, whether the commission has authority in an online universe and whether it has, whether it can be helpful in an online universe, if I understood your question correctly. There are, and I want to be cautious on my wording here, so I don't mean to mislead. Spent a lot of time helping members write the statute going forward in the last 20 years, and there was a conscious thought over the time that many instances we did not include online activity for jurisdiction for the FCC. That was intentional. The members at the time did not support additional involvement of the FCC into online activities. So there have been a number of things that have come up that other agencies have looked at, and we just mentioned one where, online identity theft. And so there are not a ton of provisions in the Communications Act or in other acts that provide authority. And we talked about 706, and 706 is one where the commission tried to use the language to help give them authority in this online universe, and how far they may take that authority is to be determined. But the commission's authority in an online universe is intended by Congress to be rather narrow. And so that's something that Congress always has the right to extend or increase or decrease. That's their obligations to do that on behalf as a representative of the American people.
Question here.
Bryce Bashik with Bloomberg BNA. Thanks for your comments, Commissioner. Wanted to follow up on Harold's question about net neutrality. What do you believe is the best way forward for the Commission in terms of regulating broadband internet access?
So as I indicated, I believe that, and in having numerous conversations both externally with the providers, with consumer groups, with a number of different folks, and I think that's a live conversation is still happening, as we go. But initially, I'm not expecting the marketplace to change all that much going forward. I do not see companies that are interested in significantly disrupting the current marketplace. I think it's in their best interest to help serve the consumer. I think it's in the best interest of consumers as well. So I don't see that marketplace dramatically changing going forward, and I would be reluctant to impose new obligations in this space going forward.
Commissioner, you mentioned the importance of having factual information. The Commission has requirements for annual reports on competition in various industries. And it used to be that for many years the Commission consistently found that there was competition in these industries. In recent years, the Commission has refrained from taking that conclusion. How do you, and I'm just curious how you see the value of these annual reports and the type of competition analyses that go on at the Commission?
Well, I would say first and foremost, I do know that the Congress is looking at whether to combine a number of existing report obligations and to change that the current structure. So I'd have to defer on that part of the equation. But in terms of whether I think that the Commission has done a factual basis in a number of reports, and I think in some instances they have, and in others they haven't. What I would be worried about, and have been worried about in my many years past, is that the reports be used to manipulate data. We should tell a very factual story and then let the chips fall where they may. So I worry that the data can be, and I'm not suggesting it has been, I'm just saying that it can be, going forward, that it be as factual as possible, and that we let the information speak for itself. And so I worry that we would change that equation, and in some instances in the past I may have been more concerned than maybe currently.
We have time for one, maybe two more questions. Scott?
Thank you. Since nobody else is asking a question,
I think it's the snow. last week that, they're bearing with questions, and now without the snow,
Since you were involved in writing 706, and most people when they read that provision, they're surprised that the court can interpret it the way they did. Can you give us any color about what you thought 706 meant when it was originally written, and how it was to be applied, and what potential kind of freedom voice you'll have as the FCC may go forward in interpreting the boundaries of 706 authority?
Well, I don't want to say too much because that's something we may or may not tackle going forward. I'll just suggest, and hopefully my former colleague will concur with me, that the provision itself is, generally, as I've seen recently written, I think it's a fair analysis, similar to what people would refer to as congressional findings, and therefore its weight should be similar. But the commission obviously has a different opinion, and the majority has a different opinion. Hopefully we can get back to the original meaning of the statute. I have difficulty, as I've articulated, I have difficulty with the court has viewed, because and quite frankly, it's somewhat a perspective of, to envision how 706 was written, you also have to put it in perspective of when it was written and who was writing it. So we're talking about a Republican House and a Republican Senate working on a provision that right after the 94 elections, a very, led by Newt Gingrich in the height of his power, that we would write something that secretly gave the commission authority over the internet, and yet we never told anybody. We secretly, and we never wrote about it in any of our analysis. We never wrote it in any of our summaries, but secretly we gave this authority. And then
Don't tell anybody.
And then we turned around and started FCC reform hearings. So we were concerned about the power of the FCC. So somehow we gave them authority, and then we, secretly, and then we turned around and we decided we had to review the authority that we already had given the commission because we were worried it was extending too far. So it's a real difficult extension on the process part of the equation to. And now I recognize courts have their obligations under what is actually written versus, and I know there are different judges that look at different pieces. I'm very aware of that universe and what they're tasked with. But it is very difficult for me as someone who was there to see a provision be interpreted based on now on what and a complete declining of what the circumstances were.
We'll take the last question right here, and then we'll close the program out.
Thank you very much. Deanne again with Inside GNSS. I was wondering if you could give us a perspective on the prospects for the spectrum that is currently held by LightSquare but is somewhat in limbo because of the difficulties surrounding that. However the company works out, that spectrum is out there and available for use by someone. Could you offer your outlook on that and what maybe the long-term perspectives might be?
So let me answer it this way. First, I'm supportive of spectrum being used efficiently, and this spectrum as well being used to provide services to consumers. I will, if I've learned anything over the last many years, this is a particularly heated discussion, specifically as it relates to LightSquared, and obviously there's a court case going on. So I'm best to refrain from commenting too much on that space. But I would suggest that the spectrum, one way or the other, should be used, and hopefully we'll get to that place where it is used for the benefit of consumers. And beyond that, I should probably keep quiet.
And with that, please join me in thanking Commissioner Riley for wonderful talk.